Yeah, well, I came of age in Buffalo, New York, that had a very vibrant alternative film scene, and and that's where I first came to know Brackage's work. I think I was 17 when I first started studying avant-garde film in a summer course, I believe it was, taught by Keith Sanborn. And there I saw several works that blew me away. I was very interested in films that made me grow, and I was like a sponge at that age. Some films were very baffling to me, but there were certain films that had a very intense impact. Unsere Afrika-Reise by Peter Kubelka,
Right, yeah.
a movie by Bruce Conner, and different works by Stan Bakhage that became touchstones to me. I argued with these figures in my mind, and that dialogue in my own imagination informed the work that I later was doing. But in any case, I can't remember the exact film I saw. There was a program of works that was shown downtown in Buffalo, New York, and it was possibly the only fight that I ever had with my father was about being allowed to go and see this character, Stan Bakhage, show films downtown in Buffalo, New York. We lived in a suburb. And so I think I was either 16 or 17, and I said, I have to go to see this, remarkable filmmaker. And my father he knew Gerald O'Grady. He was himself a professor in Buffalo, so he knew about this avant-garde scene going on. But at the same time, he was worried about his daughter going downtown, which was a little bit wild back in the day. And so I went to see this screening, and Stan impressed me as this sort of bear of a man who had this booming voice and who very passionately talked about his work and about new ways of seeing and new ways of thinking about what vision is and what one can do with film. And one of the most moving works to me and mind-bending at the time was Mothlight, which to me had this brilliant strategy. I mean, people perhaps know how it was made, but in any case, where Brakhage took moth wings and seedlings and leaves of grass and sandwiched them between two pre-perforated strips of clear tape, 16 millimeter, and ran that eventually through a printer, a contact printer, that then allowed for this print to be made of these organic forms. And so these organic forms flit by a 24th frame per second, so very, very rapid speed, but in a way that that's too fast for you to name what you're seeing, exactly as he sort of calls for in that piece that you read. Yeah. And at the same time, on a scale that is the big screen, so that as the viewer, you are in a way in a kind of pre-verbal state of wonder. It's going by too fast, and it's bigger than you are, these organic forms. So you're not the master of nature, you're a part of it. You're in the visioning of it. And so that was really a touchstone for me. Also, Text of Light was an amazing film where I think it's about an hour long, and you don't understand what you're seeing, but you're seeing sort of light patterns bending through what turns out to be an ashtray, a glass ashtray. Yeah. And there's a point where the smoke of a cigarette moves through the ashtray, and it feels like a wind in a valley or something. And it's like, and you keep on growing and sort of growing new ideas about what you're seeing, and that's very. It's very empowering. Your imagination is empowered to see in new ways, and I think that that quote became very important to me also. I mean, I can say more, but.
No, it's interesting because you feel when rereading Metaphors on Vision that Brakhage really struggles with words. Struggles. He actually fights with words, and at one point he says he dances with words, like rediscovering poetry, actually to describe something and to evoke something that is pre-verbal or non-verbal. As you said, and one thing that strikes me so much about his films is that they're all about seeing and perception, but it's almost it's almost like a myopic person taking off their glasses and actually directly experiencing the rays of light and the whole physiology of the impact of neutrons on your physiology again, because it takes away that what he calls, quote, that the absolute realism of the motion picture image as recorded by the camera is just a human invention.
Right,
yeah?
right.
So there's almost something primeval in bringing it back to the way that an amoeba or a cell or a neuron that is hit by a lightning beam actually responds to nature, which must have been like absolutely mind-blowing, and encountering that like on what I guess was a warm afternoon in downtown Buffalo.
That's exactly it. I mean, I was really into cutting loose, and that was a very beautiful way of doing that. I was also going to poetry readings where I think Robert Creeley also would attend these Brakhage shows, but I mean, where there were great poets who were Charles Olson and Robert Creeley and that crowd of people who were working in Buffalo and doing readings, and also sort of this really interesting shift about using poetry to think through the everyday, but in a way that you, as a living being, are unfolding an understanding of what's going on that is not reductive. And so also Brakhage, with a lot of the work, it's very mundane in a way, the material that's being used, but it's an expansive way of looking and seeing it.
It is, and as with some other practitioners, artists / thinkers of the avant-garde, basically like the basics of human life. So as he says earlier on, like birth, sex, death, and the search of God or the search of transcendence, is right at the center. So it employs a very sophisticated technique at a time where the technologization, if you can call that, or where basically our lives had become very technical and very abstract. It's almost like going back to the very basics of like physical existence.
I think that there was, when Brakhage used to teach, he had this one thing that he did or used to do where he would show a Laurel and Hardy movie, but he would show it out of focus. And he would say it's all about this sort of skinny form and this big voluminous form, and you know, so that you're not really getting the gags, but you're getting the motion and the dance of how they are on screen. So that was part of his opening up, sort of how to think about the vision of, you know, that's hitting your eyeballs. And when I was a student, in a way, another phase of my working was when I became a student of film, maybe a year after I went to that screening. I was in my class with Tony Conrad, and people were supposed to produce work and show it to each other every week. And I would shoot footage, but I wouldn't show it to anybody. And after a while, Tony was like, "Eve, what are you doing? I mean, you haven't shown us any of your work." And I would shoot, but I wouldn't show what I was shooting. And I said, "Okay, look, next week I'll come and I'll explain what's going on." And so the next week I brought a notebook of drawings that I had made, and I had drawn since I was a child. And the way the line unfolds on paper, it's still this way. I'm drawing all the time. They would turn into these ink drawings that made complete sense to me, and I understood it was a world unto itself, and it would be articulate and have, you know, to me, communicate very clearly within its own sort of biosystem, I don't know, ecosystem or whatever one can call it, I don't know, its own little world. And so in Tony's class the next week, I stood up and I said, "Look, when I work with the pen and with the page, I understand how to proceed." And to me, the whole interest in filmmaking for me is to now do this with film, whether with a camera or, you know, different methods like whatever, scratching or painting on film, but doing it in a way that actually gives voice to something that is particular to my own way of thinking through things, you know. And I said I remember vividly, I said, you know, we can all shoot mediocre Brakhage movies, you know, through glasses of water and prisms or whatever, but it has to be something that actually is worthy of the audience and opens up different possibilities and in one's own unique way. And how do we do that? That's the big riddle of being an artist, you know. And so it took me a long time to find my own way with film, and in a sense the model of Brakhage and the model of these different big daddies of avant-garde cinema were something that one was arguing with and collaborating with in one's mind, but they were a big part of the force field and the push and pull of finding your own way, you know, with the medium. And you know, and I would go to Brakhage screenings often, and often I found him kind of bombastic and pompous, and you know, not for instance dealing with the world. You know, there was a whole kind of phase in the 80s of, you know, you need to be political, or you have to make a comment on, I don't know, take a feminist perspective or take a, you know, a political stance, and
that wasn't for him, wasn't it?
That wasn't for him, and he stayed within his own realm of imagination, which was multifaceted, and explored different methods and sang out of that mode. And I think that now I can look back and see that from a different perspective. And you know, certain works I think are utterly transformative and revealing, and they do have in that in the allowance that an individual can sing out of their own being the way he did. That is in a way a political act, you know. It's a taking your own being in your own hands, you know.
It is, and I find it like in retrospect, because one of the questions I asked myself when Metaphors on Vision was republished is you read it to kind of rediscover the actually like the poetics of Brakhage on a page that you know from the films, but on the other hand you do get an idea of the politics of the time, and where the artist, like as a sentient being and as somebody who expressed themselves as in society or against society or wherever, was. And you, of course, you can't help thinking how that came, that particular idea of like the charismatic, sentient, expressive male that is there, and that is also in Dog Star Man in a way. Like he kind of very much so. There's this mythopoetic approach of his. Like literally, he casts himself as the more or less as the hermit who goes up the mountain, to in nature, but also to claim all of the wood back from nature. But in the end, casts himself into the role of a Sisyphus in a way, which is almost a comment on how in a way, how do you say, like how out of place some of that design for living or design of yourself as an artist must have felt in the highly politicized, like mid to late 60s.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that there were different kind of factions of people that I knew of. We were, you know, a generation of maybe a few afterwards, and even there was a point where I don't remember the year this was, but maybe I feel like it was 1989 when a group of us, after a screening of works by, I believe it was by a gang of my generation, so it was Nina Fonaroff, Peggy Alwish, Phil Solomon, Louis Clark. I think it was a screening that we went to, a group show, and then afterwards we had this round table, you know, we were having a beer and talking about the work and talking together about different ideas. And there was this point where we were taking on the fact that there was a congress of some kind, or I'm actually embarrassed to say I can't remember the event, but it was in Canada, and it invited, I think it was called maybe it was in Toronto, but I actually don't know. Have to look it up and make a note. But we drafted a manifesto, and in a way this manifesto was very spirited, and it was about, the avant-garde is dead, long live the avant-garde. And it was like, you know, this Congress that's taking place is showing, you know, the big sort of figures of avant-garde film from before, but we're here now, and you need to open up your scene to us. And in a sense it was actually naive, because we didn't know the full program of works, and people like Phil Solomon and Peter Cherkusky were actually programmed in that. In that very open-minded, I think, relatively open-minded, forum that was taking place. But it was a part of a thing that we were trying to get our own footing, and also in a way it was informed by this sense of how back in the day, Brakhage and Kubelka and different figures also were fighting for their own voices in a world that was much more accustomed to kind of traditional forms of documentary and feature filmmaking and narratives and so on, narrative kind of structures to film. And so anyway, so a lot of the filmmakers that I knew back then were, like I mentioned, were sort of, they were interested in trying to, for instance, break out of a kind of formalism and a self-absorbed poetic impulse that has a romantic aspect that Brakhage represents. And were about being in the world or being kind of trashy with the aesthetics as a counterbalance to this, mythopoetic beauty thing that Brakhage has going in some of his work. And so there was that happening, but I think that there was also a respect for what had been accomplished by these makers who had turned all of us on, actually, and been formative for our experience. And so I also had these really wonderful experiences, of being at that. Stan had this favorite cafe where he would hand paint his film and drink these certain coffee drinks that he loved. I feel like they were spiked with some kind of liqueur, but I'm not sure. And he would for hours sit there and paint, and people would come in and talk to him, and and they would disappear again, but he would work on these strips of films. And so I remember sitting with him and Phil in a moment like that, and it was lovely. He was very, at a certain point, he became very warm and less combative and really curious about people in a way that was very generous and dialogic. And it felt to me, came after a certain time in his life, like it came later in his life, as far as my experience went. He was much more approachable. And one vivid memory I have is when we went to some mainstream, big mega production film. I don't remember what it was. It was about some Russian submarine or something, and it was really not very good.
It must have been Hunt for Red October or something. It must have been late 80s, early 90s.
I think it was the 90s, but I don't remember.
The Hunt for Red October, probably. Did it have Sean Connery in it?
I don't remember, actually.
Oh, well.
I think it might
Somebody might have the answer, I'm not sure.
Yeah. But it was really funny because it was so dull and uninteresting. And Phil eventually just sort of collapsed and leaned forward and was just like this. He just didn't want to look at it. And Stan was sitting behind us, and he reached over and he rubbed Phil's back, and he said, "Oh, Phil, it's only a movie," which I loved hearing. It was hilarious coming from him.
That's fantastic. But it's funny you mentioned that, because there is a passage right at the beginning of Metaphors on Vision, where in a way he also traces a history of like cinema or film as an art and entertainment form, where you feel just from the way, and he uses a lot of very floral language in there, but that he actually finds the ones who go to the cinema and marvel at pictures in those carpeted rooms as if they were paintings. He despises them actually more than, as he calls them, the popcorn eaters, who sit in the cinema basically putting their hopes and dreams into an art form that hasn't been born yet.
No, I think he had a very open mind to watching mainstream movies as for what they were, and not and seeing a place that had in the world. And also, I sometimes suspected that he would watch the film and his eye would wander around the screen in a way that wasn't necessarily busy trying to follow the narrative, or and so just having the whole, color and light and, the wash of the visual, unfiltered by attempting to see a story in it,
Yeah, and again, like following his logic, what you then can always do is just close your eyes and basically see the cinema that unfolds when you press your eyelids.
Yeah.
which is something that I love, like a recurrent theme in his works from the 60s, and then in his writing too.
I think that there's something I always resisted when he would talk about. He would say, "I'm making films that are the inner vision, you know, the what you see when you rub your eyes," and I always thought his films they look different to me than what I see when I rub my eyes. And then I realized I think that he means that he's making something that emulates that in some way, you know, that alludes to that. You can't really do that. I mean, it's because it is optical, and what you do when you rub your eyes is not optical.
No, it's not.
It's mental in a sense. But the thing is, it has this quality that also feels like it emulates in a way how, you know, when you remember something, you have a flash of an image in your mind, and you don't see the whole, you know, I walked in the door and I sat on the bed and I said blah blah blah. You know, you have this sort of these momentary flashes, and that film also feels like it, in a way, it alludes to this sort of mental process, but puts it on the screen for us to think about those mental processes or experience them as a representation of something, you know.
Which is probably like just the most concise and clear summary of a lot of Brakhage's thinking and art. Thanks very much, Eve.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to seeing Dog Star Man.
Me too.